And we're live. Good afternoon and welcome to our CDP webinar. Now, we're still seeing people arrive, so we're going to give everybody a couple of more minutes. And for those of you who have joined already, thank you. Bear with us for a couple of more seconds and we're about to begin. Okay, and we are live. So hello and welcome. Welcome to Leap Horizons webinar, CDP Experts Discuss. So today we'll be talking CDP RFPs, vendor selection. So the questions you should be asking in your RFP in 2024, and we'll also go into talking about how to structure those questions, and crucially, how to get the right answers that will enable you to choose the right partner for your business. So absolutely thrilled to have this panel with me tonight. It's safe to say it's rare to come across a webinar like this, if not at all impossible. We have 3 market-leading CDPs today with us, and we also have a representation from a truly global brand. So we had this crazy idea last year saying, hey, if we could get market-leading CDPs talking to each other, discussing items they see as specialists who work in this industry, right? Come together, discuss the commonalities. So today it's not about pitching. It's not about comparison. Today we want to discuss what the industry sees. And, fundamentally, we believe that we need more conversations like this, right? We need more transparency, more understanding, and therefore more knowledge when selecting platforms. Because ultimately that leads to better expectations, that's successful deployments, that's better return for investment. So you'll see today we're starting with a business focus, and we have chosen to leave the technical deep dive for a separate session. Of course, if you do have technical questions, please drop them in our chat and we'll definitely pick them up. We're also talking to full stack CDPs today, or by CDPs, and that's just because composable is a whole another topic again. So it does require its own session. So for those who've joined, welcome. For the brands listening in today, thank you. We welcome your questions. For the CDPs who are joining us today, welcome. We'd love to have you on the next webinar. I know I'm speaking to some of you over the next couple of weeks. And for our competitors, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment, actually. So on to our panel. We have an excellent set of experts today. So without further ado, I'd like us to introduce ourselves. And let's start with Samantha from BlueConic.
Hi there, happy to join today and excited for this talk around CDP RFPs. I'm Sam Ngo, the Director of Product Marketing at BlueConic. I've been here for about 6 years now. And prior to this, I was over at Forrester Research covering social intelligence. So I've been working with data for a long time. I'm definitely excited to dive in.
Awesome, thank you, Sam. Welcome. Over to Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Kristina, and hi, everybody. Great to be here. So yeah, I'm Paul McCord. I'm the Partnerships Director for InParticle and EMEA. I've been in and around the software industry and SaaS for 15 or so years. The last 6 of those have been CDP specific. Been here at InParticle for 4 of those. Euphemistically referred by many as an industry veteran, but I'm never really sure how complimentary that's supposed to be.
Excellent. I will not comment. Thank you, Paul. Pleasure having you. Over to Garen.
Thanks, Kristina. So really excited to be here. My name is Geraint Davis. I'm a solution engineer at Segment. So I support customers through their technical evaluation of CDPs, which would include responding to RFPs. So looking forward to today's conversation. I've got quite a lot of experience in CDP industry, been at Segment for 3 years. and several years at Tableau and Salesforce prior to that. So looking forward to the chat today.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen, for joining us. And then we have Zach from Merlin Entertainment to share brand's perspective.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach. I'm Global Head of Optimization and Delivery at Merlin Entertainment. For those of you who don't know Merlin Entertainment, we're the second largest entertainment brand in the world, behind some of your favorite theme parks like Legoland and attractions like London Eye and Madame Tussauds. We went through an RFP for a CDP last year, and so I'm trying to bring my perspective on this as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Zach. Great having you here. And of course, you have me. So my name is Kristina Kalpokaite. I'm Head of Strategy for Technology and Data here at Loop Horizon. And for those of you who don't know Loop, Loop Horizon is an independent advisory and consultancy company providing support to large brands with their digital transformation. So we're specialists in digital with data analytics, MarTech, and marketing, and we're all ex-client side. We've delivered data-driven marketing before, and we've really enjoyed joining the dots between marketing, data, and technology. And ultimately, that enables our clients to deliver more, faster, and avoid missteps. So as part of my role at Loop, I look after a CDP proposition, and that's strategy and consulting, and that's all the way into implementation. And I have the joyous job of looking after CDP partnerships. And as part of that, bringing a panel of experts together for today's webinar. So let's get to it. So we have a packed agenda today. We, of course, have a list of questions we want to cover. However, we will keep 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for live Q&A. So if you have a question, can I please ask everybody to drop your questions in the chat? We will collate these. And then we will answer them at the end of the session live. Now, if your question doesn't get answered, don't worry, we are going to follow up and email you with this. You will also be getting a recording of today's session over the next couple of days. So without further ado, I'll kick us off with the first question, and this goes to the whole panel. So if you're a brand, and you're looking at 2024 and you're starting the CDP RFP, right? Can we talk through what do we think brands need to have ready when they start their CDP vendor selection? And I'm going to pick on Paul and take us away with that one.
Seniority has its benefits, obviously, Kristina. I love it. Thank you. There's probably a few things that stand out for me. The first thing is making sure that obviously the brand has got a very clear idea of their use cases. And I think equally importantly, that they have a very clear idea of their relative importance and the direct link for each use case to the business outcomes that the brand is trying to drive. And then secondly, do you know where your data is and in what state is it? And what I mean by that is if it's siloed, for example, how many different formats is it in? Is it easy to manage? Is it easy to bring together for whoever your vendor is going to be? And I think the last piece, which is equally critical, is sort of outside of the technology to an extent, is do you really have a full understanding or have you considered the resource requirements for standing up a CDP and potentially a new stack hand in hand with it? And then if it's your first time with a CDP, should you actually be thinking about using a third party, leveraging someone else's experience to make sure that you can get as fast a start as you can?
Yes, and actually that's a good point, right? We're at the stage now where we do see brands going through the second rounds of CDP selection, right? But you still have a lot of people who've never done this before, and they're starting to shape that RFP for the first time. Okay, so we're talking data, we're talking understanding how you're going to use that data. Resources is an interesting point. What else are we thinking?
I think it's super important to have stakeholders within the business aligned, making sure that you've brought a lot of people along the journey. A CDP is quite a fundamental piece of technology that's going to touch most parts of the business. So you need to understand most parts of the business, have taken their input and have brought them along on that journey so that you're ready for that I think that's really important. And as Paul said, understanding the outcomes of this, a CDP is a tool, and that's all it is. And it will only ever be as good as you use that tool. Are you set up appropriately to do so, to get the most out of it? And rather than thinking, what do I want to achieve now? It's a case of what do I want to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years? And am I built ready for that? Am I choosing a partner who will go on that journey with me? I think that mindset helps to really prepare you well for the RFP.
In fact, playing devil's advocate, if you've never done this before, how do you set yourself up for success? How do you know where to start? And if you indeed have the right people in the room?
Well, I think having the right people in the room is really important. I think ideally having someone who's done this before, either a partner that you're working with or someone within the business. Personally, I would suggest someone in the business who can have an understanding of CDPs and what's required to implement, but also that broader, more complex business understanding, so that you can understand, how do you fit into this equation as a business? How are you going to get the best out of this? Because no business is the same, no CDP really is the same. You've got to be able to work that magic of linking the two together in the most productive, efficient way.
Yeah, that's fair. And I suppose you then keep that knowledge of the CDP if you have somebody who's actually internal, so you don't have that loss of resource. Okay.
Ideally, keeping that in the business is good.
Yeah, or you also do what we've seen a couple of other brands do, which is go through the process with a third party and then recruit the third party afterwards to run the project for them.
I love that idea. But to be fair, there is something to be said in there of, because what I'm hearing is, how do you accelerate your vendor selection, right? So you're not spending time teaching somebody about the business, but then there's also trade-off of, well, how do you keep that knowledge in the business? So it's either a solid handover or you're transferring to an FTE. Okay, awesome. Sam, Garen, do we want to add and expand on this any further?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think every organization is, of course, different, but typically what we see is a team of marketers, data analytics, maybe a marketing technologist, and people who work in customer service or the service team, experience team, because CDP is dealing with marrying a lot of customer data across the organization and actually getting that into a place where you're using it in real time for experiences and to drive personalization and all of the fun stuff you get to do when you have a unified profile. It's important to bring those types of teams together. And again, your organization might look a little bit different, but just as a starting point, think about who touches customer data today. And what would their sort of wish list be with what they could do with that data if they actually had confidence in it, if they had access to it, and if they could actually get their hands and use it.
And I think the only other component that I would add to this, I think it was Zach mentioned that all the CDPs are slightly different. So getting a bit of an idea of what type of CDP do you want, right? I don't envy the people that are trying to figure out what CDPs they want in the market these days, because there are an awful lot of them, and a lot of companies that started perhaps as another thing and then expanded into the CDP space. So trying to get a bit of an understanding of what type of CDP do you want, and doing a bit of research ahead of time with the support of a partner, or doing some research can just help expedite that process.
Okay. You make a really valid point, actually. How do you start shortlisting, right? And I think Sam put it really eloquently in terms of who touches your data in the business, who wants the access to that data, what will you do with it? So it's almost going through it, okay, what are our use cases? What will we use our data for? I'm also hearing then inevitably, what is our underlying context in terms of the data and tech infrastructure? What are we landing our CDP into here, really? Therefore, what type of a CDP we need, because, hey, presto, we need to have these functionalities in place. Okay. So we're seeing how this is shaping up. So quite a bit of knowledge actually required to structure at the very beginning, and probably a bit of research to know exactly what you're after, even just to get to a short list. But what I'm hearing time and time again is not just what data you have, where is your data, what state that data is in, but also then what you want to do with it. And that brings us to inevitably starting to develop your use cases. But how do you go about developing a set of use cases for an RFP? And should you have them ready at this stage in the first place? Do you want to, Sam, do you want to take us away with that one?
Sure. I can kick us off on that. I definitely think that being use case based is really important when it comes to thinking about your CDP selection. You can get lost in the list of features and functionalities in an RFP and have vendors fill out a box that's like, yes, we do this, great. But it really comes down to, are they actually going to help you change processes within your teams that execute on the use case you're looking for? And for example, if you're going to need segmentation to happen within the marketing team and not for data analysts to do the segmentation for you, that fundamentally changes how you're going to use your customer data platform and therefore which type of customer data platform you're looking for. And so in thinking about use cases and thinking about, are we executing on real-time personalization in emails or changing journeys or changing customer life cycles? What are the back-end processes within our own teams that are going to have to change in order to make that happen? And if that's the case, what's the technology that's then going to empower us to do that? So just thinking about use cases, obviously it can get very hairy very fast because involving the entire enterprise in this means everyone wants their hand in something. So we also talk about the concept of thinking about, what's your minimum viable, right? Like what's the small win that you can make upfront with your use cases. Maybe choose 3 to 5 that you're really going to focus on. And then your RFP process will help you dictate, like Zach mentioned, what's the 3 to 5 year look like? And can your CDP grow with you as you expand your use cases? But what are you solving for right now? What's the immediate need? And can they do that? And can they demonstrate that they can do that?
Okay,
Yeah,
so you've actually... Oh, go on then.
I was going to jump in. I was going to say, I totally agree with that. I think it's really important to look at what you can do right now with what you've got right now. But one thing we found is that the majority of those early stage use cases for us were an evolution, had evolutions to them. So with the data sources we have that we can plug in right now, we can do X. But once we get more data sources, actually we can do Y and then maybe Z. And so we can start to build and build and build each of these individual use cases, as well as adding more use cases as we go. So I think it's really good to start thinking about the stages at which new pieces of data can come in, what that timeline looks like, and the sequencing of how you bring them in, and flow it out like that. It starts to build a more richer picture for you.
Yeah. And just on that, because I was going to say, and it probably mirrors something that Zach said earlier as well about getting your stakeholders on board. So if use cases are often thought of being at the activation end of the whole process here, but I think you need to look at what those use cases, if you want to call them internal use cases, would be at the very start as well. So whilst the marketeers will obviously focus on the activation use cases, which tend to have the commercial results, I think what you can also do is focus internally and potentially look at the engineering team. So talk about efficiencies that you're bringing by reducing the need for day-to-day plumbing. Talk about the cost efficiencies that come to bear by being able to free up that resource and maybe reallocate it to new product development or any other sort of corporate initiative that there happens to be as well. So it allows you to get that cost saving at the first instance, which potentially becomes one of the quick wins that both Zach and Sam referred to as well, while you're building out on the activation use cases at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with what everybody has said so far. And I think once you've identified a couple of those key use cases, the 3 to 5 that Sam mentioned, then thinking about, okay, well, what are the gaps? What capabilities do we need? How do we translate these use cases into a set of capabilities that we need the CDP to solve? And CDPs fundamentally solve the data problem, right? That's why CDPs exist, is to build those integrations, allow engineers to focus on other things that they are perhaps better spent their time doing, building differentiating products. And when it comes to RFP, how do we perhaps capture those use cases and answer questions in a way that perhaps ties back to the use case, right? It's not just, can you do identity resolution? It's, how does your identity resolution help us achieve this specific use case? That's a better question. That's more, you're more likely to get a much more valuable response that might point out some of the differences in how different CDPs approach identity resolution.
Exactly. It comes back to a point Sam was making early on about box ticking. Are you asking the questions actually going to make a difference, B, help you differentiate between different platforms? Because often you see questions that every CDP will just go, yes, 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 yes. Well, in some cases, they'll go, yes, 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 there's a hyperlink to our website. But ultimately, what I'm hearing is starting small. It's an interesting one, 3 to 5, because so often it's quite easy to get caught up and have, you start with 20 use cases because you're trying to cover the full business spectrum. So starting small, and I guess, proving your ROI early, and to Zach's point, you'll always be able to develop. And it's probably one thing that we see often is starting with the use cases that are deliverable, right? So not being afraid to start simple. You will evolve, right? But it's picking your quick wins.
And just one quick thing to add. Even if you do have 20 use cases, what I often find is actually those 20 use cases translate into a set of 5 or 6 capabilities that you're looking for that can then achieve those different use cases. So it's that translation of use case to capabilities, which is quite important, I think.
Excellent. Yes. And I think replaying back, that then also drives your business requirements. Ultimately, that's what goes into your RFP. Okay. Awesome. So then coming back to the previous point made, you have your use cases, you have your data. So how important is it to understand the context? Where will the CDP land, your architecture? And do you want to communicate to your vendors about what your architecture looks like right now? Does that help during an RFP? I think I'm gonna pick on Garen this time. Do we think sharing architectures in RFPs helps making the right decision?
Yeah, I think so. I think sometimes it can be quite enlightening on how prepared the customer is with their knowledge of a CDP, right? Sometimes you see a proposed architecture and then, I look at it and I think, well, actually, the best way of architecting this is to move this over here and have that connected as a source versus a destination. So sharing the architecture up front, the current state, is very useful. And when you're going through an RFP, you haven't figured out everything. So you can still get some answers to some of those questions about how things should be architected. But I would say sharing it quite early up is sharing the architecture up front can be quite useful to figure out what out-of-the-box connectors are there. If there isn't an out-of-the-box connector, how do we connect to it? And trying to get into the specific details of the connectors.
That's fair. And do we think it would ever come to a point where you look at the architecture and go, "I'm not sure we're the right fit here"?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Why would you waste a customer's time by trying to sell them something that you can't do? I mean, just 100% aligned with what Geraint said, and you tying that to the value, again, alluding to something that Zach said earlier on. If we know the architecture, we can see exactly where we fit. We can see exactly what benefits we can bring, and then we can build a timeline around when those benefits and the relative value can be brought into play as well. So you're helping build out that value timeline quite apart from any other timeline that there might be in play as well.
I think just to add to that, there's probably an onus on the brand to take a little look at the systems they've got in place currently. What are they using and how are they using them? And it's a little, I probably shouldn't say this in a panel full of CDPs, but do they actually need a CDP? Is there stuff they can be doing right now with the current architecture that would get them some of those early stage use cases to prove value before there is a need for that? It's adding a new piece of tech to the stack. Are they already maximizing what they've currently got? I think that's really important. And part of that is having effectively a RACI for your systems. What system is doing what? And the more that you understand about that, the more solid you are on what each system is doing and what part it plays, the more you'll know whether or not the CDP has a role to play in that, and which one then you're likely to be looking for.
That's actually a really interesting point. And we see this time and time again. As Garen said at the very beginning, you might be doing this for the first time. You might not have the full architecture figured out just yet, and you'll probably learn a lot along the way. How important is it to bake in some time for brands, especially if you're doing an RFP with multiple stakeholders in the room, to then find some time to regroup and go, hang on a second, do we need to course correct? Are we sure that the shortlist we had still fits our goals now that we know a bit more? I think it's one for the brand, apologies.
Stunned silence. No, I think you're right. I think you have to be willing to take a step back and look at it objectively and decide, you know what, we've gone a little too far down this path and we need to change direction. It's a huge investment, and this is something that's going to be central to your customer experience. So you need to get it right. And as a part of that, you need to ask yourself some of those difficult questions and be willing to take the difficult choices and revisit this. And most of the CDPs I've spoken to are open to that. They're open to you making that right choice because they want you to succeed. They want you to get the best out of this as well.
Fair enough, actually.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And I think, Zach, I think that's what you get when you say to a bunch of CDPs that you might not meet one. Stern silence all around.
Yeah.
On that, actually, Paul, go on then. How would you know what kind of CDP do you need? Where do you begin then?
I think it just echoing what's just been said. It's not necessarily a clear understanding of what a CDP is, because by and large, every CDP will say they cover the same broad remit until you get into the weeds. And we've seen some RFIs where realistically the use cases are either so simplistic or they've only got one, that they don't need a CDP, they need a CEP with some basic data ingestion, and that's not where we can prove value. So I think it's incumbent on the vendor also to be very honest as well. But I think to come back to just, it does seem like being a little bit repetitive, but you've got to come back to what results is the tool, the platform, whatever you want to call it. What are the results going to drive, and therefore what functionality do you need to achieve those results? So we'll talk about it possibly a little bit later, but for example, is real-time critical for you in activating your primary use cases, or is it just desirable? And if so, then that'll flavor the type of CDP you're going to go with. If it's absolutely critical, similarly in reverse as well. And it's not just down to the platform functionality, I don't think either. You need to look at the commercials that you're going to get from the vendors too. And when I say commercials, I don't mean, are they going to be flexible over payment terms, the usual sort of stuff. I think more in terms of how does a vendor price, for example, is it a flat MTU or MEU type count, or is it more value based where you as a brand can get to rank the importance of the events that you want to track and pay less for the events that are less valuable to you, for example. So again, coming back to how do we add the value the best? So I think it's a mixture of making sure that you can link those results that you did, those outcomes to the functionality, but also that you're getting the right commercial model that can help you take the time and build those cases out properly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you touched on one of my pet peeves. Do we think brands go into the RFPs knowing that there are different CDP pricing models? Or is that something to one of those, things to prep before you go in, is going, wait, hang on a second. What are we going to be charged for here? How does that match with our end goal?
I've seen quite a lot of different RFPs that ask this in different ways. And I think the answer is no, people don't know, because different tools charge in different ways. So it's important to clarify that upfront, and also kind of building on what we're talking about around use cases and different capabilities. Are the CDPs that you're looking at an all-in-one, or do they offer some composability where, okay, we've gone through the review that Zach talked about as a business, and actually we just need the data pipeline side of things, or maybe we just need activation from the warehouse, or maybe we need something else. And then figuring out, okay, well, there's CDPs out there that can give us just this piece and this piece, and then we don't need to get all that stuff in the middle. So that's another thing to factor in for pricing questions as well.
Yeah, I think certainly when we did it, we peered behind the curtain of the commercials and were scared. There's a lot of different things, and trying to find a base for comparison across that is standardized, or as standardized as you can get it, is difficult. And you need a lot of metrics. You need to be confident in the metrics you're giving, that the pricing is being based off of. That was certainly for us one of the most difficult areas and time-consuming areas, was trying to find a standardized scenario for pricing.
That's fair. And ultimately, it is, it's an extensive process. You're working with a lot of stakeholders, you're dealing with a lot of dependencies, and then you're also trying to figure out how to structure it. So it's quite a bit on, actually, to make sure that CDP, just the RFP structure itself, goes well. I know people are going to hate me for asking this question. Do you go after a template? Do you Google and go, what does an RFP template look like for a CDP? Everybody's smiling at me, but unwillingly.
The ideal answer is no, but that's what people do. So
why no? Go on.
Well, because no one, whilst you've got general use case, and whilst you've got general business results that are all going to be similar, whether it's cost reduction, return on ad spend, whatever it happens to be, everybody's situation is going to be slightly different or slightly nuanced, and there is really no one size fits all. And sorry, Zach, but that's why pricing is quite difficult as well, because no one has the same amount of events, or the same type of events, or the same needs from their infrastructure and the ecosystem that goes with it. So it's not like the old hardware world where you could say it needs to have this speed, this hard drive, and a 15-inch monitor. Thank you very much. That shows you how old I am. It really does need to be customized, and we can help. I think that's the point. The vendor can help. The vendors who are involved in those discussions, or the third parties, can absolutely help with that, because they can help the brand get the understanding of what they need to meet those primary, secondary use cases.
That's fair. So as a brand, do we think brands should be sharing the vendor list, for example? Does it help the vendors to even to qualify themselves in or out based on who else you see on the roster?
I don't know that we'd ever disqualify ourselves based on who else is in play. And I think that's more down to the fact that there's X amount of 100 companies claiming to be a CDP than anything else. I think until you get a view of what the brand is trying to do and what their use cases are, and that's when you see how good a fit you are. And that's where it's incumbent on us to say, we're really not a good fit. We don't think we can help you. Let's not waste your time.
Yeah, I think the sharing of a vendor list can be quite useful as a buyer, because you then get the best responses from each of the vendors that might point to weaknesses in the competition. Whether or not organizations choose to do that, I think varies a little bit culturally as well. When you're working in the Middle East, you often get very direct questions about, these are the vendors, tell us exactly why you are a better fit for us than these 3 other solutions. So then you can get some very specific bits of advice to go and ask and investigate each of the vendors and say, hey, tell me how you solve for this problem. Tell me how you solve for that problem. Yeah, at least that's my perspective. I think it can be quite useful, but equally, a lot of organizations choose to keep that vendor list quite close to their chest until very late in the game.
I think certainly from my point of view, it shouldn't be a problem. I think a good vendor is like a good politician, if there are any, in that they should be thinking about their virtues and their benefits, and not what's wrong with the other people on the list. Keep it to how you fit the use cases, and then it doesn't matter if you know who it is or not.
I think that's a really good point. So Zach, from a brand perspective, we've gone through this before. Can you give us some other examples? What did you find useful? Questions asked, answers given. What helped you in that decision-making process?
I think for us, a little background, our RFP, our desire to move towards a CDP was initially led by our IT teams. So it our RFP was a lot more around data ingestion and how do we get the data in there? How do we do profile unification, et cetera, et cetera. What we didn't get until much later on as we were going through the process was an understanding of what we wanted to do with that data and how we wanted to activate upon it. The bits that we did ask, that we did find really useful, were around that ingestion piece, around the pipelines and what have you, but also around what will you do and what do you need us to get other software to do? As all CDPs are different, some can do some elements of, for argument's sake, advanced segmentation. Others will need other tools to do more advanced segmentation. And so we need to know about that, because then it's relevant to the wider business case and the wider architecture. I think the conversations we had earlier about should you bring your architecture up front, I think there's current architecture and future desired architecture, which for us was continually evolving through that. So having an understanding of what additional pieces of software we needed in there was really good. One of the other areas, as we started to focus more on activation, is what are the integrations with other pieces of software, but primarily what's in our tech stack right now, as well as what we're looking to potentially move to in the future, so that we can start to see, first of all, what's the openness of this piece of software, where can it connect to, and where are we feeling a little restricted, but also how quickly can we mobilize some of those early stage use cases with our existing tech stack, and where can we build for the future. Those were certainly some of the pieces that we found most interesting.
Okay, thank you. So that's a really nice segue to as a jumping off point, I think, because what we're seeing overall, right? You have your architecture, fine, you have your context, but it's really about, and that will get you some way, right? You'll understand what ingestion, what integrations you'll need, but then fundamentally it's going into, well, what you want to do with that data. And then it also drives, well, what kind of CDP do you need? And I'm hearing no templates, because no single business is the same. So inevitably you're having to customize. And so I think it's a great example. We see this time and time again. CDP RFPs can be started in IT, but then inevitably they end up becoming a bigger piece, because the end user, it can be marketing, it can be analytics. To Sam's point, it could go all the way into CX and into your customer service, right? So it's really about how you're going to use that data and what are you using it for. Okay, so then let's take it up a notch. Let's go into CDP functionalities that we're looking at here. So we talked about advanced segmentation. We talked about use cases. Inevitably, we see this sort of the trend of focusing on marketing activation as use cases. And Paul rightly pointed out, but there are some baseline use cases you really need to have in place, i.e. your baseline data model. What is your single customer view? Now, every CDP will also kind of come with their IDs and ID resolution. So one for the panel, and throwing it out there, master ID and the ownership of that master ID. Do we think that's part of the CDP RFP? Where is it best placed? Where do we typically see it being sat? I'm going to pick on Samantha for this one.
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I think there's a little bit of a fallacy, right, in a single customer view for the enterprise, because honestly, in a CDP, you don't need to store every single piece of data that you have on your customer, because it's not necessarily going to be used. And so the way we think about unified profiles is collecting data, unifying data from across your systems and sources that's actually going to be used by your marketing team to deliver on something, or to use by your analytics team to calculate a customer score, and then used by your marketing team to actually act on the predictive score that comes out of it, right? And so I think when we talk about master ID, typically we see it living in like a master data management system, MDM, for example, can include things like billing history, other things like that, that might not necessarily need to live in your customer data platform, which kind of goes back actually to a point made earlier around cost and pricing. You know, if your CDP is going to charge you for the amount of data that's in your system, do you really need to be collecting all of it in order to act on those use cases that we talked about at the very beginning? And that's all part of this RFP process, right? Thinking about what are the trade-offs that you're actually going to make in your systems, and where are those processes actually going to happen? Where does the data need to be stored in order for you to execute on the use cases you're looking for when you're looking for a CDP in the first place?
Okay, that's fair. That's a really good point. Just making conscious of time, so I might do a short fire round on the next ones, because I've written down points people were making, and I want to make sure we cover this, because I can't remember exactly who it was, but somebody mentioned real time and talking about how do you define real time? First of all, do you really need real time? Will you be activating, and what does it mean? Garen, do you want to talk to us about that? Real time for CDPs.
Yeah, I think at the core of a CDP is the ability to integrate and route data in real time from A to B. But that's just one part of the CDP. So asking a question in an RFP, do you provide real-time capabilities? You're going to get an answer of yes, but really think about how it translates back to the use cases. If you don't have a real-time use case for immediately activating or doing something with an event when a customer does something, then perhaps that's less important than some of the other questions that you should perhaps focus on in the RFP. But to dive a little bit more into real-time, you know, real-time event routing is just one thing. Real-time resolving of identities is another. Updating to profiles, real-time computations, real-time audiences, real-time journeys. You know, when you start to go into the different capabilities, trying to figure out, okay, what is a batch process that's available to us, and what is also available as a real-time capability within each of the different solutions that we're looking at, and whether or not you need real-time across all of them or just across some of them. So I think, you know, real-time means different things to different people. If you have a batch process that gets updated once per week, moving to once every 6 hours is going to feel like real time for the business. So yeah, that's what. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add.
No, exactly. I think I'm gonna actually push us on to the next one, because you've touched a really interesting point here, which is routing, right? Journey orchestrations, for example. How are you activating that data? Are you connecting personalization? Therefore, you need real time, or are you activating through something that's going to ingest your data, wait 48 hours, and then update? And in which case, you probably don't necessarily need that real-time processing. But so are the systems that will connect adjacent platforms that will going to come working with CDP, sequencing of those platforms as well? How do we go about solving that? Paul, do you have any thoughts on that? Or is that part of a CDP ultimately as CDP's responsibility?
I'm glad you asked that secondary question, because when you asked me, do I have any thoughts, that gives me an opportunity to talk for a very long time. I always find this particular piece quite interesting, because I think there's an assumption that if you're bringing in a CDP, you're probably going to either build or entirely refresh the stack that you've already got. And I think there's one key thing that's sometimes missing, because that's ignoring the possibility that it's actually the activation tools that you've got are already good enough. But the issue is actually being the quality of the data going into them. So it might actually be that getting better data into those existing tools finally unlocks their potential for the brand. So that's, I think, one core thinking, one core premise. But if we assume that the brands, let's say, don't have tools, or that they are going to change, and then, of course, assuming that they, of course, rightly go CDP first, typically what we see is somebody putting together a CDP, a CEP, and an analytics stack. We have seen, depending on the use case simplicity, they might go CEP, CDP first. It's not ideal, but it's what happens. And they'll typically have a data warehouse. So you've got that very basic cycle of ingest, create profile, create audiences, get your campaigns activated, analyze those, start all over again. And excuse me. And then increasingly, we've seen quite a lot of loyalty platforms coming in alongside the CEP as well, just as they've gained in popularity as well. But I think just coming back very quickly to something that both Geraint and Sam said on the questions they'd answered, that if it doesn't tie to a use case anyway, then it doesn't really matter, what you're doing. It doesn't really matter what order it's coming in. You've got to tie whatever you're doing with your stack into what the primary business needs are. But coming back specifically to building your stack, I think the risk is if you decide to change your activation tools either for the sake of it or without first making sure that the data you're activating is as accurate and as compliant as it possibly be, then really what you're doing is you're risking shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, really. You don't know if those tools that you've got aren't fit for purpose if you've only ever fed them incomplete or compromised data.
That's a good point. So I think we're coming back to those basics, right? Picking the use cases that will actually going to deliver some quick wins. I'm going to call them foundational use cases, establishing those first, right? So it's great to have fabulous marketing activations and really advanced things, but unless you have the base layer right, everything else might just fall through. Okay, so when getting closer to the end, so I'm gonna ask Zach one question, and I'm gonna allow ourselves to enjoy a little bit and reminisce on our favorite CDP experiences. But before we go there, or RFP experiences, I should say, if there are any, Zach, from brand's perspective, obviously hearing what you've heard today, reflecting on your own RFP, anything you do differently, lessons learned, key outtakes from your perspective?
Absolutely. I've mentioned some already, but there'd definitely be something in there around business outcomes, knowing what it is you want to achieve, how it fits with organizational goals, having senior stakeholder buy-in in that piece, understanding what it is, and then feeding that into the RFP. This is what we want to achieve. How can you help us do that? Because effectively, you're not just buying a piece of technology. Ideally, you're buying a partnership. You're buying an engagement with a business who is invested in your success as well. So giving them as much information about that and you being as clear about that as possible and how this is going to contribute to it, I think helps to start to ease that whole process. It starts to focus down your RFP questions to those core elements, and it starts to refine your use cases to things that are materially going to impact that. I think the talk about the foundational use cases was really, really important. We found that important. I'd also suggest, I know we talked about 3 to 5 use cases. I'd say go nuts, write 20, 50, 100, and then narrow them down to the ones that actually are going to make the biggest difference, that you can activate on now, that are going to hit those business outcomes. Because the more you have, you'll get to them eventually, but it gives you the scope to truly explore what a CDP can do for you and where you can take it.
That's fair enough. And I'll add to that, because we see this time and time again. And this is, if you've never written a CDP use case before, be specific. I think that if you're gonna take one thing out of this today, other than not using templates, and really get your use cases down on paper and sit down with the business stakeholders and understand what you want to use your data for, and then stick to it, actually, in terms of selecting the platform that can deliver to that piece and data that will deliver to that piece. But be specific, because I think it's so easy to write a use case that is quite broad, right? And we see this time and time again. And then the moment you force somebody to sit down and go, right, what is this going to do for us? Great. Where does that data sit? Oh, we don't have that data. How do we get it? Do we need a CDP for this? That's where it becomes very, very real very quickly. So on that, we have 1 minute until we go to live Q&A. We have questions that are piling in. But before that, any parting sort of favorite RFP moments that we've seen? Go
on. Favorite RFP moments. I think I can probably think of many different RFPs which have been quite fun to be involved in. And for me, that's because it's not just about the document, right? The whole reason why you write an RFP document is to help you understand which vendor is the right one for the business. And we haven't really touched on the broader process of the RFP and the different stages that you might go through, from kind of discovery to maybe initial demos and completing the RFP document. But then what happens after that? If you kind of shortlist a couple of vendors, should you go and run a proof of concept for a couple of weeks to actually get hands-on with each of the platforms? Maybe see if you can deploy a very basic test use case. I think whether or not you add that into the RFP is, of course, down to each organization. But I think that is one of the best ways of truly validating, maybe the last two vendors that you're deciding between. Which two should we go? Let's run maybe a side-by-side POC. So those are the key takeaway for me. Fun things from RFPs are those types of RFPs where we actually kind of fully engage with customers and go through those types of engagements.
I guess, yeah, to be fair, so what POCs, what do people think? I think it does come back to Zach's point where he was making earlier. You are selecting a partner that's going to be with you long term here. So you really need to make sure you get this right. So actually getting to know the company is probably not a bad shout. How do we feel about that?
I'd agree. I mean, but again, I'd put the onus back on the brand as well and say, if you're going to do a POC, you have to be serious about it as well. So you put as much care and attention into getting the POC ready with the parameters and the timelines on that as you should in for your RFP as well. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is get people to prove value and value over time. And you're not going to do that if you simply say, you've got 2 weeks, spin it up, show me how you can join things together. Thank you very much.
That's fair enough. Okay, right. Okay, so I think we're out of time. I'm going to take us to Q&A because we have a fair few questions that I've built up. So, look, we did have a question here about, and bear in mind, these CDP RFPs can last for quite some time as well, right? You're talking, it's not uncommon to see a year-long one, if not, God forbid, longer. If it's hard to predict what you'll need long term, right? How do you go about selecting an RFP? How do you go about selecting a CDP? And is it almost, does it differentiate whether you have a CDP or you don't have a CDP? Should you start there?
I think, yes, it can be difficult to predict exactly what you want, but as a business, you should have long-term goals, long-term aspirations. You should have use cases that do stretch a reasonable amount, or at least KPIs that you're looking to move the dial on. So I think you can start to shape what that journey looks like. You may not know exactly, but at least you've kind of got a direction to move towards. We can never operate with 100% knowledge of what's going to happen in the future, but you do the best you can from the knowledge you've got and choose accordingly. And to be honest, as we were going through our RFP, one of the things I knew is there were going to be things that I would want to do that I don't know that I will want to do. And that's where you're relying on the expertise of some of these vendors in what are they doing with other people they're working with, what can their system do that I've not even thought of yet. So there is an element of that in there as well.
Yeah, to add to Zach's point there, I was going to say exactly that, which is also talk to other customers of the vendor, right? Get on their website, read the case studies, talk to the customers, and really see like where has their maturity in using the CDP gone for their business, and what new use cases have they been able to implement over that 3 to 5 year period. Knowing where they started and maybe, took a crawl, walk, run approach. Where are they now in that run? And was the CDP able to grow with them through those different stages and phases that they went through for their use case iteration? We can think of maturity, I think, from a use case perspective, but also at a business level, right? Can they take their first party data and create new revenue streams based on assets, their first party data asset, right? Do they have a new ad revenue stream if you're a media company, because you are able to do personalized content? What did that maturity look like? How did that timeline kind of frame out if you started at a smaller, less mature state of maybe just, I want to show personalized content on site? And then where did we get to when we said, well, now we're providing our ad partners with this product that's actually gained us millions in revenue because we can actually package what we've done on site and provide it to our ad partners as well.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is, even if you don't know where exactly you're going to be long term, you will still probably need to be making a decision which CDP to select, because there's just such a big variance. And reality is, if you don't know where you will be, at least you're starting somewhere, you're getting foundations in place. And like you're saying, the process itself is likely to actually teach you a fair few things. But what I'm also hearing is time and time again, don't go alone, right? So you're either choosing an implementations partner, you're either choosing the collective of the CDP vendors who you've shortlisted to advise and to help and to learn during the process. You're definitely enlisting the customers as well, right? So wherever possible, getting that advice, getting that experience. So even if you're doing it for the first time, at least it doesn't feel like you've never done a CDP RFP before. And crucially, coming back to the very beginning, make sure you keep that knowledge in the business afterwards. Okay, great. One more question. I think I'm sensing I know what the answer is going to be, but any specific channels we see that are really good sources for the CDP data? Is everybody thinking depends where your use cases are? Is it just me?
Yeah, I think
Go
it
on,
depends.
Gary.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
it kind of depends on the use cases and some companies have an app, so that's going to be a source of data. Some companies just have a website. Some companies have multiple brands as an enterprise organization, each with their own app. So yeah, it does vary. And some organizations already have their data pipelines configured and they're happy with the data in the data warehouse and they just want to activate it from there. So this is why it's important to come back to the use cases. And I can't believe we've made it 57 minutes through a webinar without talking about AI. Because like these, the ambitions that everybody has these days is to leverage AI, but you need to get an understanding of where your data is today and the data maturity that you need to get there.
I think I'm going to give an answer to this one, actually. I think that the best sources of CDP data are those which tell you the most about the customer, because the CDP is there so that you can deliver a better customer experience, deliver more relevant communications to the customer at the right time. And you can only do that with a good foundation of good, solid data that tells you about your customer in the right kind of way.
Yeah, great summary.
Awesome. I'll add, if you're going to use it, I think to earlier Sam's point, don't forget you'll be paying for that data getting stored in there. Potentially, depends. If you know your pricing model, basically. Okay, right. So with that, I'm getting a signal that we're almost out of time. It's 58 minutes I'm going, and AI mentioned once. When we did meet to say, okay, should we talk about trends for 2024 RFPs? And we said, well, actually, the answer is going to be AI. So on that note, I'd like to thank our panel of experts. Once again, we had Samantha from Blueconic. Thank you. We had Paul from mParticle. We had Garen from Segment, and we had Zach from Merlin Entertainments. And I've been your host, Kristina from Leap Horizon. To everybody who listened in, thank you. Join us for the next one, either on our panel or come back again and post your questions. Just a quick reminder that we will be sharing the webinar recording. So if your question didn't get answered today, don't worry. We're going to regroup and we're going to follow up. This is an involved panel. It has homework. So look out for those follow-ups in your inbox and for the invitations for the future webinars to come. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. Have a great end to your week. If you'd like to find out more, get in touch on LinkedIn or via our website, leaphorizon.com. And that's a wrap. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.